The impeachment inquiry we talked about in our last segment is providing a lot of insight into the Trump State Department. The Ukraine scandal is one major issue, but so is the mess in Syria, as Trump's abrupt pullout from the north is causing chaos in the region. Reports of clashes between Turks and Kurds threatening a fragile ceasefire.
We have 35 hours left. If they don't withdraw, our operation will restart.
On Thursday, Vice President Pence announcing Washington and Ankara had reached the 5-day arrangement where Turkey would pause its military operations to allow for the Kurds to withdraw from a buffer zone along the Syrian Turkish border. But over the weekend, there were reports of gunfire in that area. On the ground, the Kurds remain furious about Trump's withdrawal of U.S. troops from northern Syria, some hurling potatoes as the military moved out, many feeling abandoned and worrying about ethnic cleansing at the hands of the Turks. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who led the delegation to Turkey alongside Pence, defended the deal Sunday.
We were very clear, and the Vice President could not have been more clear when we were speaking with President Erdogan in that Turkish-controlled space, that there wouldn't be attacks on minorities, that this was about getting a ceasefire, a secure area, and that this, in fact, will save lives.
The administration is considering leaving a small number of U.S. troops in eastern Syria to protect U.S. interests and combat the Islamic State.
We have a small group there, and we've secured the oil. Other than that, there's no reason for it, in our opinion.
Our next guest says the Trump State Department is in crisis. Joel Rubin was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration. Joel, earlier in the hour, we played a clip from Mick Mulvaney's press conference on Thursday when he said there's going to be political influence in foreign policy. And there is, but that's not really what's being asked about Trump and Ukraine, and that may be leading to some confusion among people. So what are the normal kinds of political influences in foreign policy, and what's different about what Trump did with Ukraine?
Yeah, Andrew, he's right in the sense that there's political influence in foreign policy, always, every day, political influence, for example, from Congress, which is a political body, and they weigh in, senators, members of Congress, or the president who's elected or has senior political appointees advising him or her. They do engage in their political views on foreign policy. But that's not what we're concerned about here with the Ukraine impeachment inquiry. There, it's a question of using foreign policy to help support his political personal ambitions. That's a very different way to go about foreign policy. It sort of flips the actual script, which is using our politicians to advance a foreign policy is the right way versus using our foreign policy to support a politician. That's the wrong way, and that's what people are unhappy about.
If Trump's approach is normalized or allowed to go unchecked, I assume that's going to have detrimental impacts on our foreign policy going forward, correct?
Yeah, it would be a feeding frenzy. Could you imagine? Every day we would have concerns about, is China today going to be paying the president a little bit more money at his hotels to get a better trade deal? Is Iran going to threaten our cyber defenses, and therefore maybe Facebook will come to the president and ask for a little help, and we'll go easier on Iran? How about Ukrainians and some of the individuals picked up at Dulles Airport a couple of weeks ago for trying to funnel money into our elections directly from foreign oligarchs? So we have to control our democracy. Americans, we have to decide who our elected representatives are and how we pay for them. And we need to have bright red lines. And the president is trying to dirty over those lines and make them very gray. And that's dangerous to the whole foundation of our democracy.
I want to ask you about Rudy Giuliani. We've heard his actions described as a shadow foreign policy involving our ambassador to the EU, even though Ukraine's not in the EU, as well as stories that we're reading that people inside the State Department did not know what other people were doing. You spent time in the State Department. How far afield from normal is this? How dangerous is it when it comes to Ukraine and also beyond Ukraine?
Well, I served in the State Department in the Bush administration as a career official and then in the Obama administration as an appointee. And we never had individual private citizens managing foreign policy to a foreign country on behalf of the president, not in coordination with the agency. Every so often, a person who is a close friend of the president may be tasked with doing something very closely in concert with the State Department and the officials. But that's not what was happening here. Rudy Giuliani essentially was running his own State Department. He was doing the work for the president directly, while our officials who actually have responsibility for that portfolio, who would respond to Congress, who would be responsible for representing us, the public, to foreign governments, they were out of the loop on what Rudy Giuliani was doing. So the foreign government, in this case Ukraine, was getting two different messages coming at it from the United States. One was to support President Trump and his personal ambitions through Rudy Giuliani, and the other was to somewhat support American goals in the country, which then made it incredibly difficult for the Ukrainian government. And we're seeing this on a daily basis in their discussions. Very difficult to understand who he's supposed to respond to and how he's supposed to respond to really support and engage the United States. And that's a big mess, and that is just not how business should be done.
And now how can we trust anything that comes out of Ukraine, given the gun that they have literally to their heads? But I want to slide southwest from Ukraine to Syria, where our abandonment of the Kurds continues. The president over the weekend dismissed this as long-standing conflict, and hey, sometimes you have to let them fight like two kids in a lot. I'm curious if you can recall another time that the U.S. position on a conflict between two of our allies has been basically, whatever.
Now, this president, he is allowing something to occur, and not necessarily through passive action, and he's falling on false arguments to allow it to occur and undermining our relationships with the peoples of the Middle East and the Kurds in this case, but also really violating the basic ethic of the United States, which is that when we are engaged in the world, we are trying to prevent mass atrocity, not accelerate it. And so this is very dangerous. The president is talking as if we had no relationship with a force, with individuals from the Kurds, with a fighting force that had 11,000 of their own men and women killed fighting ISIS on our behalf. We sent them millions of dollars to train them. We partnered with them. We built bases for them. We protected them. The idea that he somehow doesn't know this happened means that he's either completely disconnected from the national security community, or the worst part is that he just doesn't care. And that's a really dangerous place for the United States to be.
As you were answering that, we were looking at some images from Syria, among them Kurds pelting our retreating American troops with rocks and food. The stories about the U.S. bombing its own camps because they're going to fall into opposite hands. Russians taking video from abandoned U.S. sites, almost taunting the U.S. I'm just curious your reaction to that. And also between Ukraine and Syria, what's the damage to America's credibility and leadership?
Well, it's extraordinary to see us essentially being booted out or kicked out or jeered out, really, by our friends and allies who no longer view us as friends or allies. And it is a far cry from the promise that President Bush had in 2003 to be greeted with sweets and treats like liberators, that was a mistake, that invasion of Iraq. But it brings it to mind because they don't want us there anymore when we betray them. It's not that they didn't want us there prior to this decision. And going to this and to Ukraine, your question, our word is the bedrock of our ability to engage the world. We can use all the guns and all the weapons we want, but that's not how we convince people around the world to be friendly to us, to not foster terrorism, to open up their markets, to enable us to have economic growth and development here. We need to have good relationships. And if countries and peoples don't look at us as trustworthy, we aren't going to get those relationships, and they're going to look elsewhere, and they already are. In the case of the Kurds, they're looking to Assad, they're looking to Russia, longtime antagonists and enemies in some cases of the United States. They're looking to Iran. This is not a good outcome for the United States, and we aren't going to have credibility when we engage new potential partners, when we have a conflict and say to them, yes, trust us, we'll be there for you. They're going to look at us with a very skeptical eye.
And as if Ukraine and Syria on our plate at the same time wasn't enough, Afghanistan is in the news again. We know that the president wanted the Taliban to come to Camp David and was hoping to work out a deal there. Now there's word the administration is working on a troop withdrawal plan even without a deal in place, and the president confirmed that today. It's another seemingly surprise troop movement announcement from this president. I'm curious what's the impact of that on our troops? And then looking at Afghanistan in general, if we pull out, is that just another Syria waiting to happen, another vacuum without our presence there?
So when I served overseas, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and we always would look back at Washington and our president to see what they were saying and doing. And for our troops in the field, they have hearts and minds and ideas, and they want to know that the commander-in-chief is making the right decisions. And I think our troops, when they evacuated Syria, they felt shame and embarrassment, not because of their actions, but because of what the president did. And the president has said, oh, he's done with endless wars. He's going to bring our troops home. It turns out he's not. They're going to Iraq. So it's very confusing. And for Afghanistan, the idea of a precipitous withdrawal without an agreement in place with our allies that is supported by the government that we've been working with for well over a decade in Afghanistan could be calamitous. And the Taliban is not rooted out. We need to have an agreement before we leave. And we came close to having negotiations with them here. I was a supporter of that. It was criticized by some. I believe we have to have negotiations with our adversaries. And if we just walk away like we've just done with Syria, it will make the Syria debacle look like a small-scale debacle compared to Afghanistan.
Joel Rubin is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration. Joel, appreciate a few minutes. Thanks.
Thanks.
And up next, a look at the 2020 race. New numbers are out. They give an interesting picture of where things stand. We'll tell you who's up, who's down, and what's next after this.